Council will call this meeting to order. For the record, it is August 26, 2025 at 4:32 PM. We'll begin this afternoon's work session with roll call attendance.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilman Cavanagh.
Here.
Councilwoman Little Roberts.
Here.
Councilman Taylor.
Here.
Councilman Overton.
Here.
Councilman Whitlock.
Here.
Councilwoman Strader. Mayor Simison.
Here. Next item up is adoption of the agenda.
Mayor,
Councilman Cavanagh.
we adopt the agenda as presented.
Second?
I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the agenda is agreed to. Next up is the consent agenda.
Mayor,
Councilman Cavanagh.
move we approve the consent agenda as presented for the mayor to sign and the clerk to attest.
Second?
I have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the consent agenda is agreed to. There were no items moved from the consent agenda. So we will go into department reports. First item up, or the only item up, is destination downtown discussion. Good afternoon.
I think we're good. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. Pleasure to be back in front of you. Okay, I think we're good to go. Oh, the keys, right? That's the way we're gonna drive. Think. Oh, there we go. Okay. Perfect. Okay, we're back and thank you for having us. Appreciate it. Just again, Chris Danley, Vitruvian Planning Project Manager for Destination Downtown. And with me is Aaron Qualls. Aaron will come up in a moment and you'll get a chance to know him. He's with SCJ Alliance, who wrote the design standards that is mostly of topic this evening. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be before you again. So what is our purpose today? Our purpose is to do a couple things. Really, we want to make sure to go over a bit about Old Town specifically, because that's where and why the design standards were created. So this is a very symbiotic relationship between the two, right? So if we're comfortable with most of what Old Town's vision is, then the intent is that the design standards need to make the vision happen and vice versa, right? And making certain that all of that works hand in glove. And then to certainly answer any questions that you may have, certainly address any comments, and be able to make and maximize the most of our time today. So I want to start off a little bit about how we got here. So the design standards started off, and some of you were here, I believe, to understand that there was my understanding was that there was a building that was proposed that stood out, let's just say that, and it was quite bright and vivid and so forth, and it began a dialogue about design standards, which then really ultimately led to a request of staff, and I'm sure of you all with leadership, for this particular set of tasks to be in Destination Downtown. It was included in our scope of work and informed throughout the process through that input that was had at multiple levels. Staff comments were had, also so too were many of yours who submitted comments. And we took those comments, especially from staff, and really worked to implement those into the revised set of design standards to move forward. And other things to understand is to remember that the MDC board looked at this and approved with unanimous consent, and we were here in front of you last fall with a good warm reception that was had. Certainly a desire to have further dialogue, which is what we're doing here today, but overall a good warm reception. I kind of showed this to you last month. I'm just going to keep showing it to you because I think it's important for you all to get that background and make certain where this stuff came from. It wasn't just coming from us, but it did come from all of the different bullets that you see before you. Everything from the individual and stakeholder meetings that were subject specific, through some of our public outreach, dairy days and so forth, online surveys of the public, and then multiple check-ins with the board and so on and so forth. So none of this stuff really towards the end should have come as a surprise. It was iterative as we went through the process, and all of these things worked hard to inform it. So I want to set the stage for the next handful of slides on Old Town. And then I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and he'll walk you through really, again, the design standards specific. So what was the goal? The goal not only for the whole plan was to go obviously from Spine, I always just kind of refer to it as Freeway to Fairview, but is to address these little sub areas as you saw last fall, and specifically in terms of Old Town. What were we trying to achieve in Old Town? I think most of these are agreeable to you and probably also replicated in your comp plan and so forth, and trying to achieve things like thriving retail, making certain we take care of that existing neighborhood while also promoting a downtown that is inviting for new businesses and potential residential. Attractive streets and spaces, and how do we continue to march toward the most appealing and humanized space, not just in Meridian, but even in the valley. So all of those things were very important. The economic activity, certainly we got to make sure to pay for it, where are those dollars coming from and the revenues that are coming from it. And all of those things were really important. But ultimately, it's about making this corridor and this Old Town really continue to come to life in that next iteration. So as a reminder for Old Town, now this in and of itself was an exercise because Old Town means about 29 different things when you ask different folks from the city of Meridian, whether it's leadership at one and defining it, staff and documentation, the city, the residents and so forth. Everybody had different versions of what that meant. So we tried our best to truly define that, and we did so by what you see in front of you, that traditional city core, which is a documented location within code. Looked at what we call the neighborhood enhancement areas, and I'll get into a bit more the neighborhood or the railroad corridor and that what we call that traditional core 2, which is south of the railroad corridor. What are we trying to achieve? In some of this, I'll touch on it a little bit more, but some of the things I mentioned too, going vertical along the railroad corridor, infill, and really also trying to revitalize some of those areas that maybe need a little bit of help. So let's start with the middle. I'll work towards the edges and then turn it over to Aaron. The railroad corridor, we certainly saw that and a lot of feedback on it, that where density and where height was maybe most supported was along these particular parcels that front the railroad corridor on both sides. And so the thought process was here to allow that to occur, go a little bit higher. Your code already has some provisions to go up to a certain height. I think we're fairly aligned with that, just making it a little bit more official, getting up to maybe closer to 100 feet and so forth. All right, just point of reference. I believe, and maybe staff remembers this, but I think Shields is pretty close to about 100 foot. I know when I took my daughter on the Ferris wheel on the inside and felt like we were up pretty high. So I think we're about that. Trying to embrace that corridor, linear green spaces. You all have been working hard for years to get this rail with trail. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's happening. I thought I saw in a construction document, it's moving forward or funded at least. So kudos to you. So it's really, again, about enhancing that space as much as possible and really bringing that dream to life. The next sections, that city core 2 and 1 beyond the railroad corridor, is a step down. This is the transition that honors especially the next group of folks who are the residents. And it's not trying to just box them out in terms of height, but also still maximizing some of those parcels as much as we can. So an acceptable height that does get up closer to the 75 feet. And that pretty much aligns with what you've seen in some of the more recent developments. We heard that pretty consistent, but I will tell you, we had people tell us from 2 stories to 20, and it really ranged. So we tried our hardest to find that middle ground as much as we could. Trying to make it a pedestrian-rich environment. I think you've heard us talk on that quite a bit, the Festival Street concept, and other things that really, again, try to make these things continue to come to life and fulfill that ultimate vision. And then the neighborhood enhancement areas, that's what we're just kind of calling that. And so this isn't really about making any recommendations on big wholesale changes. These are established neighborhoods. This is where people live. And so we were certainly sensitive to that. And I think so too was all the input that we gathered on that. It's really about just kind of enhancing it. you know, making it a little bit more unique where we can, where there might be interest. And so that's really what it was about. Did have some recommendations on some degree of infill, things like ADUs, for example, taking advantage and really helping people maybe be able to stay in their home, frankly, because we know that the values have continued to go up so much. So too of their property taxes, right? So maybe maximizing their units and their properties in ways that might be achieving a different housing goal, but also bringing a little bit of revenue into them, possibly things like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Aaron. Aaron will introduce himself a little bit and then go through the design standards, where they came from, what are they trying to say, and what are the objectives before we then turn it over to you for any Q&A. Aaron?
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, Mayor, Council. It's great to be here down in the southern part of the state. I'm from Sandpoint, Idaho, and a little bit more about me. I've been with SCJ Alliance for about 3 years now. Before that, I served as a planning commissioner. I served as an urban renewal board member and a council member, a staff planner, and planning director. Now, in addition to working with cities and counties throughout the state and in other states as well, I occasionally even help developers through the entitlement process. So I've been looking at this through a variety of different lenses. So this picture I love of Old Town. I love it because it's really good urban form. It's a place that you would want to visit. I look at this picture and say, I'd like to walk around in this place, right? And it wasn't because of zoning codes or planners or consultants. It's because that's how people built cities for thousands of years, right? They built them for people. And a successful downtown area is a place you want to go and see people and be seen, which is perhaps evident by if you look at what I think the driver is looking at in his rearview mirror. So before we, thanks you, next slide. Before we get into the details, what we find when we work with a lot of jurisdictions is that when you're talking about a vision and goals, you generally find a lot of consensus. But when you start talking about how to implement those goals and policies, that's when debate happens, when you get into the details. And that's where we're at while looking at some recommended design standards for consideration in your traditional city core. So we've looked at a lot of the past efforts you've done, which has been some really good work by the city. Your historic preservation plan, your street cross-section master plan, your comprehensive plan in 2019, your strategic plan in 2021, and destination downtown in 2024, and the work that Chris has been doing. There's a lot of common themes that we found for downtown by looking at all these policy documents. People-focused, walkable and bikeable, beautification, community identity, and active and vibrant. So we looked at policy to see how we might implement it, right? And you have done some implementation we found in your code with the public realm. And this is what's showing on the right side of your screen there is a section from your own code that talks about that public realm where it tries to create that active and vibrant sense, that sense of safety, comfort, and interest for pedestrians in the downtown area. What we're talking about now is the other side of that, the private realm. And what we have tried to do in these recommendations is maintain your traditional urban form, make it people-centric, help enhance the identity of your downtown, and also help continue that vibrancy, that trend of vibrancy that Chris was talking about. At the same time, we're also, and this is where the different lenses come in from how I look at code, is to help make it more streamlined, predictable, clear, balanced, and flexible, which I think is all very important. This is not, the recommendations that we provided are not an overhaul of your code. It's more of just a shoring up here and there based on your existing policy and based on the trends that are already established. So first, to set the stage, it's always important to talk about where these apply and what flexibility there is built in from the onset. So what we'd recommended is that this isn't required for any new construction wholesale, but a 50% increase of an existing building, then the standards kick in. And these are just considerations and things to work out through more through with your staff. That way you don't want to create a real barrier to further development, but an appropriate standard for where they kick in. We also recommended some administrative approval criteria for 10%, like basically an administrative waiver of 10% of a numerical standard, which would replace your alternative compliance provision, which I read through and found pretty subjective. And in my experience as both a regulator and an applicant in certain situations, putting that onus on staff to have that subjective power can be really onerous for staff, and it can also subject you to liability. So a clear numeric standard that staff can provide flexibility for without going through a public hearing process, I think is an important consideration just in the practice of administering code. But then anything beyond that, another relief valve for a design review. That could be a design review board, could be your planning commission, could be a city council, where a public hearing is triggered for anything more than that. Now, this is for a waiver, not a variance, and I think that's a really important distinction. Variances are a really high bar in Idaho code, where you have to really prove that there's a steep slope or maybe a waterway where you can't meet a setback. A waiver is something different. It's just an important distinction legally. So a waiver has a little bit more flexibility, less criteria to meet to have a waiver, because these are design standards, not something that you want forgiveness in code, but something built into code to provide that flexibility. Okay, now the stage is set on computer. Building orientation and civic space. Let me get a little bit of water here. I just got back from a vacation, so here we go, hitting the ground running with Chris, no surprise. Right now, I think your code requires minimum 40%, building fronting a street. In the downtown, we're recommending at least bumping that up maybe to 50%, so that you have development on the street frontage, with a 0 setback, unless there's a dining area, plaza area, or public art, something to help create that vibrancy. There's some exceptions in your code now, I think, for drive aisles and parking areas, and that can kind of break up that comfort level and pedestrian experience of creating a destination that people want to be. So these are, again, small tweaks that could go a long way. Corner lots, beveled corner. I know this is very detail rich, and feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a specific question about any one of these recommended standards. And this is kind of an a la carte, but some of these standards kind of go together. There's sometimes a carrot and stick that kind of are married together through these. So beveled corner, you can see in that top right image, that's a picture of a building from Italy somewhere, but it's not dissimilar from some of the development you see around downtown Meridian today, some of the older development. And if you walk around, which we did quite a bit, you can see that these design standards really are intended to preserve and continue that trend of what makes a downtown, a place where people want to be. So primary building entries face a street or provide a pedestrian connection to them. Okay, architectural components. And you do have some of this, and for clarity, this would, in the areas that you decide to apply this, which we're recommending the traditional city core 1 and 2, and maybe there could be some variation between those two, because they are a little bit different. So this would replace your ASM manual as it's known for just this area at least. And we built in some material standards where it's not but we've tried to consider it so that there is some room for additional materials, but that at least 50% of the facade materials can match what's there so that there's some cohesion with the traditional building materials used in more of the older style buildings. That could be brick, wood examples, but it's not limited to those specific materials. There's lots of affordable material options to builders to make them look like it. And you see examples of that if you walk around downtown where materials are mixed up and it works. I think the lofts is a good example of where, you know, those building materials are mixed up. So some clear standards for that. Consistently spaced windows, so maintaining that opaqueness for ground floor storefronts, which makes window shopping, which makes permeability, and it creates that sense of visual interest for folks walking downtown or just experiencing downtown with similar shaped windows up above. Pitched roofs with eaves, or if a flat roof, a cornice on top. We're not going so far as to require certain types of detail, you know, to match a historic theme of the era, but just detail. And then when you get longer buildings, breaking up the vertical facades can help maintain that visual interest and create that sense of comfort for pedestrians as well. So we've recommended for every, you know, if over 50 feet, maybe break up by two foot differentiation. Again, there's still relief valves built into this, but those are the standards that we're recommending. And then blank walls that can be visible from a public area. This will happen unless you put some standard in there, and you do have some, but again, shoring up that, well, it could be a change of materials, it could be some landscape screening or a mural, something to maintain that visual interest. And then a lot of other related considerations, which take them or leave them. I went through your use table and I looked at, well, what uses might not be compatible with, you know, creating that downtown sector, that people-centric experience. One of them is maybe consider prohibiting drive-throughs, or at least certain types of drive-throughs, which can create a huge traffic impact, right? Drive-throughs can generate a lot of trips, and they also can compete with that pedestrian-oriented feeling that a successful downtown will have. Limiting low-density development, removing off-street parking for building use changes or for certain types of commercial or even all commercial. A lot of downtown areas are eliminating off-street parking. It sounds, you know, bold, but for commercial uses, in order to encourage that redevelopment or reuse of existing buildings, really considering the parking requirements, which can be a barrier to creating the sense of vibrancy that is called for in your policy. Something to consider. I know you guys have been down this road already with parking discussions, and I know that raises a lot of red flags, but there are other options to consider without just wholesale eliminating parking. You can, there's variations on the theme there, but it's something to consider. And then showing up your landscape screening where you do have parking lots facing the street. And there's another provision that we found which would allow to 120 feet, I think, by your existing code, with that 20% just administered, again, by staff, which, again, puts a really big burden on your existing staff to make that call, and clear, predictable standards, but with opportunities for flexibility. That's really it. I'll turn it back to Chris, unless there are questions. I know I threw a lot at you to think about.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So just to wrap up, I want to make sure we hit on a couple of points, but again, the point of today and moving forward, and so I know of a concern that was raised, what is it that we want, right? What is it that we want out of this exercise, the previous exercise from last month? In this particular instance, this is definitely one of those, the design standards is specifically that are administrated by the city, right? So this is one that definitely needs to be blessed by you all in order for your code to reflect what we've discussed and reflect those visions that are adopted in the plan or put it forth in the plan. And so we got to get to that point if this document is to move forward that has been supported, especially for the last couple of years. So that's really the end goal. In terms of the procedures, with the time that we have left tonight, about half an hour or whatever, happy to answer questions, happy to have robust discussion. Certainly, I requested that Aaron be here in person to make sure we have, all of that at our fingertips. Formally, if there are comments that you want to put forth, we ask that they go to staff, that staff be able to reconcile them, because I will just tell you, I know on my desk till right now as we speak is still a stack of comments that came from everything. And there were definitely times when there were competing interests on the same subject. So that reconciliation is important as much as possible, in addition to staff's comments as well, that then ultimately make their way to MDC, and then us and MDC, because they are my client, work through those and go forth in the document to make changes that are agreeable, and hopefully get back in front of you for formal adoption and get this thing going. So that's really more of the formal and informal for this evening. And I think I've just stated all that's on the screen. So we are good. Happy to have discussion and answer any questions that we can do so.
Thank you. Councilman Cavanagh.
Chris, Aaron, Ashley, Dave, appreciate the presentation. Appreciate the roadmap too. Helps me kind of follow where we're going. So I think one of the reasons why we're taking on this one this afternoon is there are some places where MDC is a certain stakeholder, right, of our downtown, where maybe there's some alignment with our planning staff, which are our subject matter experts, but there are other places where maybe there is some delineation between the two. So can you, Chris, maybe walk us through what are some of the areas that you have seen that maybe you and staff, their City of Meridian planning staff, are not on the same alignment when it comes to design standard recommendations?
Mayor and council member, honestly, I don't recall there being tremendous differences. Maybe you all have different recollection from that, but I don't recall. Now, granted, this exercise when we got comments was about a year ago. So I don't have all of those off the top of my memory, but I don't recall there being anything, any comments from staff that were just massive game changers. There were some adjustments, there were some tweaks and revisions, and I think that's only natural, especially with the vastness that is this document, as well as the visions and of course the standards. But I don't remember there being anything major.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilman Cavanagh.
I guess maybe I'd ask the same question then to our planning staff, if they're in concurrence, if there's areas where they've got some concerns?
Mr. Mayor, Council President Cavanagh. Yeah, I don't, tremendous, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of good things in the plan. We certainly, I think a lot of the tone of our concern about some of these things in here is, and I know Chris touched on it again today, is the outreach, right? We have a UDC focus group, some of these standards, when you call it standards, there's a certain bar of outreach that we're expected to do as city staff before we just go and change code. So I think a lot of a tone back to, again, Chris and Ashley, are what's the public involvement? I was at some of those events, but I didn't facilitate them. So I just don't know, how did we notice the public? What kind of stakeholder outreach happened? I do have a list of some things that are questions, right? Not necessarily concerns, but that's, I think, at the heart of some of the series of discussions is this is an elephant. With the Old Town stuff, I think there's a lot of good things. I just can't sign off on them without having sort of that, again, the public outreach and input that makes me more comfortable. I'm not saying they did a bad job, it's just different than what we would do if it were a city-led effort. And I can go through a couple of height, right, is another one, even with this topic that, that we have a maximum of 100 foot in our city core. And again, there's only one now. This plan calls for 2. So one, we haven't even established some of the districts that are called for. And so then that even kind of conflicts with our comp plan map, our zoning map, and some of those things. I shouldn't say it conflicts. It's just not consistent, right? Again, we haven't established that TCC2. It doesn't exist. So, but along the rail corridor, even some of the things like, the property owners on Broadway, if there's a 100-foot building across from some of those single family homes, I don't know what the outreach was there. Would they be comfortable with that? I get the concept, and I I think this is a major asset that we should look at redevelopment. But if we all of a sudden allowed 100 feet by right and not allowing them some, I know parking, for some of those industrial users and things can be an issue. So if we just allowed, was pro build or any of those customers to just build a 100-foot tall building without some other conditional use permit or oversight, there's just some of the concerns with how this would actually work. And if we are even on the same page with the vision and the goals of some of these things. We talked about some of that conflict, right, as you move further down. That's really where I'm still at is, are we on the same page with even some of the vision that's portrayed in this document? So I'm not saying we can't get there, but there are some of the things there, the residential parking zones, that's also called for in this section of the plan. Is that something we want to adopt and implement? We've talked about that briefly a little bit last time, not a ton, but that's something here too. It talks about creating residential parking zones.
Can I just address the last piece real quick, if I might? Because I think it's important. I think it was brought up at the last hearing with regard to the residential parking permit. Just as also a reminder on that, in the details of that, that's a residential-led initiative. Point, end of story. That in the recommendations of that, it's not an establishment thereof that comes from the city. It's more of a grassroots desire amongst, I think the threshold was 75% of residents would need to come together in order to craft that. So just as a point of clarity, because I think I missed that at our last meeting. So just to point that out.
And just to piggyback off at least what Caleb said, from my perspective, just my perspective, if there's anything in here that is a change of code, I'd expect to go through our own city processes. I don't see us, adopting anything that wouldn't at least follow our normal elements from my perspective.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yep.
What I'm hearing is that there's maybe not necessarily a conflict of recommendations. The conflict is in the process in which these recommendations would be approved. Is that your understanding? And if so, then I guess what would be the best way to have a collaborative process that is, following the city's way of doing business, but is paying respect to that work and effort that's went in from MDC as a downtown stakeholder to bring these recommendations to us?
And my 2 cents is if you're in general alignment with the principles of this, then you turn over to the planning department and let them go run their processes. Because this is your starting point for your general community feedback. And it may be a very quick process because everyone says, you bet 100% we already bought and sold on these. What's take you so long, dumb city? Or it could be first time they've heard or seen it, you don't know. And by the time you get to it, but that's, a very generic way that I've looked at it through this is, and, to Caleb's point, one of my very basic questions is this eliminating the Old Town district and the Old Town zoning? Is this overlaying, repealing? I mean, there's process questions in there, especially if you start doing some of that. And I don't know that I've heard or seen the answer to some basic questions, let alone, others. I'm not looking for an answer right now. I'm just.
For what it's worth, I think that the Old Town zoning is great. In fact, I think some of just Chris talking, take the consultant hat off. I'd love to see the city take Old Town from the freeway to Fairview. I think it would take away a lot of ambiguity. And if that's the desire to be old downtown, then you have a zone that is pretty awesome at making that downtown. I think that the design standards certainly align even more so with the suggestions of what the vision for Old Town has been, and maybe some of the modifications that have come through with this process through significant input, including yours last fall, and through the process. But ultimately, I think that Old Town zone is pretty good. One question though is, as I mentioned from the outset, is asking people what Old Town even is. You get different answers, legal answers, historic answers, cultural answers, geographic, answers. So there's some challenge there.
So maybe just to the simple one, I say simple, height. I mean, there's different standards for height in all these different areas. How do you apply that to Old Town? Is it a separate overlay that people have to go look at? They look at Old Town and then they have to realize that there's another layer of individual components, or would you leave everything in Old Town, create separate areas and update all the standards? What would be the recommendation of either staff or yourselves or?
Mr. Mayor. So I guess to Councilman Kavanagh's previous comment, I didn't have a lot of concerns with overall standards. The process to get there and council support, on the other hand, is different. So we were before you 3 years ago and we didn't have marching orders to do this. So we haven't done anything. I'd want to hear council say, do this, and mayor and the council say, do this. To standards and, you know, how we do this, Mr. Mayor said it spot on, like, is it an overlay? What is it? We don't currently have alignment between zoning and the future land uses, or between zoning, future land uses, and some of the areas identified in this or the previous destination downtown documents. In order to put everyone on an equal playing field, i.e. not have someone do extra standards for Old Town and instead choose to do residential where you don't have any standards, you have to either do an overlay or you have to do a rezone. So one of those two things has to be true. Does that answer the question about overlay or rezone? Those are your options if you want everyone on the same playing field and you don't want to disincentivize Old Town.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Schrader.
maybe switching gears briefly. Reading the plan, the biggest theme that I think was missing from the plan, or just something that I think might deserve a bit more thought or explanation, is I think it's really important, and what makes Meridian different is that we're a really family-friendly community. And I want to make sure that the downtown area is oriented toward families. You know, I think a lot of cities have done a good job. Copenhagen comes to mind, but I think there are others where, like, every plaza has an opportunity for a micro playground or a micro play structure or some kind of an experience that I think can draw families in and help them interact with the space better. So that's just some feedback on something that I would have liked to see a little bit more. I think is more of a family theme. You know, I think it's natural that the urban environment is going to be geared toward younger professionals, and it's going to be geared toward, you know, potentially older residents as well. They're looking to downsize and want kind of a more vibrant life. But it also should be a place where families can feel comfortable, interact with the space, make it a really fun experience. So that is just something I felt was missing, that I'd like to see a little bit more of. I also had some, I guess, questions about the process, and it feels to me like at some point we should be having a public hearing. Like, that definitely feels like, yeah, it needs to be part of the process. And then that gives the opportunity for the business owners to come and weigh in. And I agree. I think you've had a lot of great, like, stakeholder engagement. I just think it may not have met the typical level that we would see with, like, a citywide code change. So that would be a suggestion. I'm very sensitive to the, I guess, the areas that you have marked for neighborhood enhancements, and I kind of wanted to drill into that a little bit. So what would the maximum height be in those neighborhoods under this plan? I wasn't really following that.
Thank you, Mayor and Councilman Strader. I don't think we even touched on the height changes to neighborhood
Yeah.
enhancement. There's no recommended changes in terms of height. I think we just simply said that the promotion of infill and going up to 2-story, which is already allowed, is ideal. I think if anything, we went to maybe 35 feet, which 2.5 stories, you know, maybe a 3rd story, but really it's not even going to that point. It's mostly about infill, enhancing those areas, to your point about, especially your first point about the families and maintaining that presence. It's critical that we not necessarily, you know, do the very things that could force people away from the home that they've been in, you know. So that's definitely a part of the mantra there. So we don't really touch that.
Yeah, and Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Schrader.
That's where I think the public hearing process and more of a city-led process, I think, could sort of tease some of that out, because I agree with the planning staff. I think if you have a situation where there aren't a ton of places where I think that interface would occur here, but it certainly could, where you may have a 5-story building pretty close to, you know, single-family residential, or you might have a 100-foot building that's not that far. I can't think of a better way of running families out of town than having such a contrast. And I think we need to think about how to transition to those neighborhoods. So that I just think that's something that we need to work through. I liked the human-centered design elements. I liked the Festival Street concept. I've been a fan of that. I think that's beautifully done, and thought there were a lot of good ideas there. I liked a lot of the details around beveled corners. One thing I am concerned about, though, that I'm sort of trying to figure out is, I think what you're asking for is a change to our typical processes as a city. So, you know, for example, getting rid of alternative compliance, that's a big change. And I have a hard time, I think, with doing that in just one area without considering if that makes more sense as a citywide initiative, like, for example. So there are just some things where I'm struggling a little bit with having a different process for this area specifically. If it's a good idea, it may be something that we should just consider, right? So that's something. Design review has become a big topic for us lately, especially in my district. We've had just some acute situations that have come up. I think it honestly is just circumstances, but you know, a design review board, for example, that's an interesting concept to me, you know, but that's something that we could leverage, I think, to solve wider issues potentially. So I'm really looking for our staff, I think, to try to take the plan, take our existing process, and kind of give us a roadmap as to a way to marry them together. So I'm interested in figuring out how we could accomplish that. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I guess that's just some initial feedback. I do think there are a lot of really good opportunities around, but there are things like, you know, the pedestrian infrastructure and bike lanes, for example. Like, as a city, our philosophy around biking specifically and how to handle that, we've really embraced like detached multi-use pathways, for example. That might be more challenging in the downtown environment, but how can we, you know, make sure that we have buffered, like separated bike lanes, for example, things like that. So I just think there's more to tease out and more to talk about. But for me, if there was one thing that I felt was a little bit missing, it was that family focus. So I guess I would challenge you a little bit to think about that. And I generally like the plan. I do want to say that I generally liked the plan. I felt it's moving things in a positive direction, but I just have real concerns about how to marry this plan up with our process. And ideally, I would like to not have a totally separate process for this one area. I just think that's very inefficient. And ideally, we could avoid that. That might be best.
Mr. Mayor, if I can, just real quick, there's so much in the plan, right? I even was guilty of talking about parking, which we've already sort of covered that in this area, or design standards and that it's going to be different, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things about enhancements that the Parks Department should like, I'm not volunteering to say, let me lead that effort about making downtown parks, right? So there's so many things that other departments would even have to get into. If we're going to adopt the plan, we need to, it's not just planning department. I just want to put that out there. I'm not necessarily volunteering to go and update the parks, you know, master plan. There's a lot of things in here, and on the agenda today, we're talking about design standards and that process. I guess I just want to kind of put that a little bit back in context. Not that I don't appreciate all comments on this, so I'm going to be quiet here in a second, but I just want to put that out there. Really, our comments back mainly should be about city code, the comp plan, the vision, and those design standards that are called for in this plan. There's other things we need to talk about at some point, but today, I think it's mainly about the design standards.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Strader.
Maybe, but I have a different view. Sorry. I read the plan as kind of a theme. Like, so when I read this plan, like everyone's different. You're, no offense, but you are a planner. And so it makes sense to me that you would focus on the design standards, whereas I read the plan and I care about the design standards, but I'm also saying, okay, are there themes of focuses I think are missing or that need to be more of a focus? And so if I have a comment like, I think, ensuring that public plazas and public spaces include some type of a micro playground or some type of family-friendly environment, whether it's planning leading the charge or whether it's parks that gets involved. I mean, I think there needs to be a citywide effort for sure. And I don't mean to say that like your department would be uniquely responsible, but I still think if we don't comment on those themes, when would we?
It's a
So-
fair question, and I'll just say, sorry, Mr. Mayor. It's a fair question. I think when we had one of the first conversations with council, it's how do we start taking bites of this element? Is it by area? Is it by topic? How do we, and so I just wanted, on the agenda today, it says design standards. Right? I know we're talking about Old Town and design standards. So I think, again, all comments are welcome, like whatever information you want to share. But I just want to lumping them all under this umbrella of design standards and then planning running with that. So I hear your questions. There's just a lot in the plan that I think we need to fully understand as we move to the next topic, vet those things fully, whatever that means.
I'm going to go to Councilman Taylor, who's unmuted, assuming he had a comment on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I got a handful of comments. I do have one question though for probably Aaron a little bit, and then I have some comments. But my question is about parking a little bit. And I know we had this discussion last time, but to me, this is an interesting topic because I really embrace the concept of making this more of a walkable, pedestrian-friendly part of Meridian as opposed to, some of the other locations. And I think that's going to be an important distinctive component of downtown Meridian. So can you talk to me just a little bit more about the suggestion of removing off-street parking requirements? And I just wrote some notes down, so I might be missing part of it. Help me understand from your point of view to make downtown Meridian a little bit more pedestrian friendly, what you would recommend we do in terms of parking downtown. Not so much where to park, but how to kind of accommodate that pedestrian-friendly parking and sort of, again, removing off-street parking requirements. I'm not sure exactly what you're recommending with that. So if you could maybe elaborate just a little bit on that.
Well, thank you for the question. And I'll be honest, off-street parking requirements was a little bit of scope creep for me in the design standards, which has really been my lane. But there's a real nexus between how much surface parking you require and the intent of the design standards, which is to create, as you said, that pedestrian-friendly environment. So what I kind of baked in is just additional considerations, just from my view of doing an audit of your code and listening to people at public engagement events. Not necessarily a full-blown exempt parking, off-street parking requirements, within an area, although a lot of cities have done that for their downtowns, not just for to create a more pedestrian-friendly environment, but also to maintain and enhance your tax base, because parking lots don't generate a lot of tax revenue. Buildings do, improvements do. And in my experience, developers, even if there aren't parking requirements, particularly for residential uses, are going to want to provide parking so that they can market their units. But for commercial uses specifically, I noticed that a change of building use, an existing building, you change it from an office to a restaurant, boom, you have to put in 10 more parking spaces. That means either paying exorbitant fees if you have an in lieu fee, or it means knocking down another building, which over time can diminish what a downtown feeling is, which is a compact, dense, walkable environment. So, and really, this is just ideas to get the ball rolling, to get the wheels turning. By your planning commission, and you're absolutely right, it should be driven by your staff. It should be a city process, and not only should there be a public hearing, but probably several workshops with your planning commission and staff driving this. That's how it should work, and maybe even additional broader public outreach about this. Rehabbing existing buildings to create, to incentivize repurposing buildings and investment in your downtown, and to maintain, and not just eliminating park or reducing parking requirements, but also the standards by which you allow for surface parking to the side or behind, with that street frontage, so that buildings are closer to the street, which slows down traffic, which makes it more comfortable for pedestrians and interesting, which is paired with those, details of breaking up floors and incentivizing canopies and pedestrian amenities. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's the thinking behind it. And Chris can add to that.
I just have an example that might illustrate the point on this issue. If McMinimans came to Meridian tomorrow and said, Coal Valley Christian, that's amazing historic building, is something that we have our eye on, and we'd love to come to Meridian and be the first McMinimans in the state of Idaho, if you are aware of McMinimans and what they do. An amazing company that does historic preservation and makes a place that was once an incredible, thriving, cultural, valuable place alive again, right? If they came to you tomorrow and said, we love that building, we want to turn it into a small restaurant, 20-room hotel, whatever else, right? But the parking standards require that we have 50 off-street parking. We only have 40. What are we going to say, right? Are we going to force a part of that parcel to somehow be, bulldozed if we have to in order to accommodate that? That's, I think, a way to illustrate that. I know in downtown here, the church was, I don't know what the status is, but the church was discussed as being for sale. What if that became a concert venue tomorrow? That's an amazing addition to downtown, right? But if that parking part of things trips us up, that's, I think, what Aaron's trying to illustrate, is that what flexibility may we have in order to get some of the things that we know and want to have in downtown Meridian, family friendly, right? Talk about some of those types of things that could come with some of those adjustments.
So
And I just, if I can, real quick on the bike thing, I just want to remind everybody that as we were doing this process, ACHD had their plan as well that was going concurrently. And so we did work together to ensure that both were informed. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that.
So are you saying you're going to deliver us a McMinimums to the area? Is that?
Mayor, that has been my dream from the beginning of this project. I love that. And we were in Bend. My family was in the one in Bend not but a handful of months ago. And I think that would be an incredible place for the first in Idaho.
And I want to go back to Councilman Taylor. I don't want to take over his time, but in a response to another question, when you get into it, like, okay, that's good for today, but what happens when you're Washington, D.C. around Adams Morgan and you have no place to put cars anymore? Well, what's your threshold for when you say, okay, we're going to take that standard away? But Councilman Taylor, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and Aaron and Chris. That is helpful, because I do think, again, that parking strategy that we did ultimately need to sort of settle on as a city is going to be important when we're considering some of these design elements. Overall, let me give some feedback. I actually really appreciated this document. I thought there were a lot of good suggestions. The way I read it in relation to how we as a city should interpret is, I feel like you're challenging us to think a little deeper about what we want to see, right? And I think maybe it was Brian had mentioned, 3 years ago, there was no specific challenge for the city staff to necessarily start working on it, knowing some of this was happening. And I see this as a very helpful in the process of challenging our thinking what we want to see. I do think what we're going to have to do between this document and the city is we are going to have to kind of sit down and really spend some time clarifying what we specifically want to see, right? Building heights along the, the rail corridor, an overlay, a rezoning change, all these things I think is actually going to take a lot more work. And I agree with everything that was said previously by staff, and Councilwoman Strader mentioned it too. Like there's got to be a little bit more of a public process where we're inviting that information. But overall, I really like this. I believe one thing that we really should focus on as a city that would be helpful is creating really the having a what do we call it? I'm losing my word. Sort of the downtown street festival area. Maybe that's the wrong word. I'm losing my thinking here, but having something that draws people downtown, I think would be very helpful and would really spur on that. So I appreciate having you focus on that. But I think everything that was shared tonight is helpful. I'm very supportive of what I'm seeing, but I want to rectify that with a more robust public input into finalizing things. But I think what you've done for us here is really accelerated a lot of our work and given us a really good product. So I do appreciate it. I think I think some of my specific questions will probably be better served for when we're actually getting down to, what do we want for building heights? Is it 100 feet? Is it 75 feet? I think, yeah, I think that's probably my comments for now.
Councilman Overton.
Playing off the backs of the other comments that have already been said, and some very good ones. First off, I'd like to commend Caleb for his comments about how we require our planning staff to vet out different things when it comes to standards. Because the first thing I got concerned about when we were talking about the standards is I didn't hear that we had representatives from our development community, whether it was residential, business, industrial. You could have been in this room a week ago, and that was incredibly valuable information that we got last week, that if we hadn't had it, we wouldn't have been able to make the decision that we made going forward with changes to our standards. So it's very important that we hear from them, not just the homeowners, but we hear from that development community. They play a great role, and we do require that when they do their meetings and they invite them and they come to the table.
Can I address that real quick, if I may, Mr. Mayor and Councilman Overton? We had a full-on development subgroup, and there were particular members of downtown who were part of the process all the way through because they just wanted to be. So that whole concept of property owners, business owners, and their staff was definitely a piece of the information gathering process specific to Old Town at a focus point and throughout. I didn't mention that. That's my fault.
Mr. Mayor? Not the owners, developers, the ones that are going to be coming in here and making the changes, that are going to be bringing in something new. That's the ones. What I don't want to do is okay, I'm going to say it, no offense. But when I read this document, I felt like I was playing SimCity. I was taking this incredible document and looking at this part of our city and saying, wow, what could I turn this into? But the problem is I lived here too long. I remember what's there now. And then one of the first pages, it's Respect Meridian's history. Define that for me. What do you mean when you say respect Meridian's history while promoting a modern downtown? Because that's a really good sentence, but I bet it means a lot different things to a lot of people.
If that's a question, I'd love to answer. So that's the challenge. And so to your point, that's like, for example, I'm just going into very specific detail, but to Aaron's point with the Shamford Corner as an example, that's been around for hundreds of years beyond Meridian, right? But respective of the existing neighborhoods and the history that's gone in there, certainly trying to maintain some of that. I think some of the building materials that you might expect to see in downtown are indicative of that. At the same time, there is the desire and need to modernize and to continue to grow into the directions that are acceptable. And that what we heard from, all the folks that were involved in this. So, even another example outside of design standards and Old Town, as you move north, there's definitely language in there with regards to the residential businesses and the the neighborhood commercial activity that takes place from the north part of Carlton up toward Fairview, and the recognition of the value, the Eppies of the world and all the others, that is an amazing asset for downtown Meridian and should be preserved. And it's why we kept that in terms of the recommendations of just, yeah, this is great. Let's keep this type of a thing because it is unique to you, you know. So I think we tried our best to try to balance that, but also recognize those development pressures and the modernization of approaches that we're seeing, and even cauterizing some of your plans. So as much as we could.
Mayor, follow? So I appreciate that, because when I was reading part of the plan talking about the rail corridor, and it talked about where our city hall was located and talking between our city hall and rail corridor, it kind of eliminated Zamzows.
Mm.
And I get it. That's Meridian 75 years ago. But that's part of our history. I look at that and I appreciate that. But see, I remember when Clint Eastwood came to town filming the movie here. The Hungry Onion still stands where he shot the movie. The Speedway still stands where he shot part of his movie. We lost the Farmers and Merchant State Bank where he filmed the bank robbery as part of that movie. But those were iconic things that happened in our city over time. And I hate to see us discard some of our past and some of our history in the interest of modernization. I struggle to find where that common ground is between where you want to modernize and where we want to leave the way things were. I mean, Meridian Meat and Sausage has been in this community for decades. It's not going anywhere. Renee just retired and turned the business over to his son, and he plans on running that for another few decades. And I'd like to see that happen. So I struggle with looking at your plan and how we're going to, those beautiful pictures you show and some of even the streetscapes out of Kirkland, Washington, how you're going to do that here.
And I don't know that even the last iteration of Destination Downtown was able to answer some of those questions, because it is a difficult one. Even in the concept of the Speedway, there's so much discussion within the community of what happens with the Speedway. It is historic, but for others, and I'm not saying this, so don't hit me, but others would argue that it's a different thing because of its noise and the activities that sometimes can come from it. So historic preservation, as well as future growth and the planning that goes, can often butt its heads. And it's painful and it's not easy. You know, I think that as much as we could try to preserve some of those spaces, but recognize that the market forces and the property owners and developers also have a private property right to do certain things, are also part of that conversation. And it is definitely not an easy line to walk. But we gave it our chance, and that doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean it's not amenable to the types of things that I think were brought up tonight and maybe the next time we're here and after that.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Will Roberts.
Mr. Mayor, first of all, Chris and Aaron, great project, great report. Thank you so much. Really tiny question compared to some of the things my fellow councilmen have brought up, but I was really surprised with the recommendation to go just for pitched roofs. Probably because right at the moment, it seems like we're getting a lot of people that want, I think I saw a pergola on the top of the Keller and Associates building it. Flat rooftops with event space or common space seem to be kind of the trend from what I'm seeing.
Thank you for that question, opportunity to clarify. So there wasn't a recommendation for just pitched roofs, but where pitched roofs are allowed, just some standards for them. And where flat roofs are proposed, some standards for them, really a decorative cornice. So there's options for both, just some minor standards for each. Was what I try to put in there. So you're not excluding one or the other, but just so that they're done in a way that doesn't isn't out of context with the rest of the downtown.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Taylor.
Yeah, I have a question. It's maybe for staff, maybe even for you, Mayor. I think there's a lot of work to be done to for us to get, figure out exactly what the design standards are going to look like. So I guess my question would be, if we get to a point where we sort of dial in on exactly what we want to see, do we want to do it through an overlay, a rezone, or by amending the comprehensive plan? What's sort of the better process by which we might want to actually nail down what these design standards would look like? And I'm curious, staff feedback from them from a sort of practicality, and Mayor, maybe even from you, if you have some thoughts on that.
I can honestly say I have no thoughts on what's the best approach to that and defer 100% to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and Councilman Taylor. So we've thought about it, and honestly, I think it may be a combination of all three of those. And that to me is some of the crux of the question. Are all of these things that are called standards in here, they're also recommendations, are those things we want to standardize, or do we want to encourage and promote and do some of those other verbs that really lead towards the vision, but it's not in black and white that thou shall or shall not. So I think that's some of what we need to figure out. So some of those things that aren't prescriptive standards, but we want to encourage and promote, could go on the comprehensive plan. And then kind of like, depending on what happens, what we can't do is design standards in our comprehensive plan. If we're gonna have standards, those need to either be in our code, well, they need to be in our code. Or you could put them as an addendum to the code and cross-reference our architectural standards manual or downtown standards. But again, I think it's some combination TBD. And I think that's part of what we need to fully understand is how many of things are baked enough where we can push them forward to public hearing versus need to be talked about more, and we explore these things more, and maybe eventually they turn into code or standards, and maybe they're longer term things like Brian and I were just talking. Like, again, I like a lot of the things, but if our design standards for downtown say a building along the rail corridor has to be a minimum of 75 feet and have doors that face the railroad, I don't think that's going to be received well, right? If those standards aren't for the here and now, we're going to get pushback. So we need to understand where we can have alternative compliance or design standards exceptions or whatever that process looks like. Or is that something that just says, we really want you to think about embracing the railroad corridor because it's coming, whether it be with bus rapid transit or commuter rail or light rail or something, or just a park even along there. Really try to embrace that and encourage it versus requiring it. So I think that's where, again, staff kind of in the middle. I don't want to say things are bad. It's just how do we take them to the next step, right? And have those dialogues.
So I want to get to Councilman Whitlock before we go down this road, but maybe be thinking about this real quick. If you look at it, the appendix, if you look at the items in the appendix, staff, I think if you went through and were able to identify where you would recommend the changes, and I think that starts with the overlaying, do you create additional overlays or not? I think that would help answer some of the questions through that, but don't give us an answer now. Councilman Whitlock.
Thank you, Mayor, and Aaron and Chris, thanks. Let me just preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I've spent more than half of my adult life working in downtown Boise, and I've never thought about design standards in the last 35 years as I've worked in downtown Boise, but I did this weekend after reading your document. At some point in the early 1900s, they built the Idaho State House. And next door, they built the Federal Building, which is now the Bora Post Office. Two very majestic buildings. It seems like nothing else really happened until about 30 years later when Art Deco seemed to be 20 years later, Art Deco seemed to be the style. So you had the Hotel Boise, which was the Hoff Building now. You have the old Ada County Courthouse, again, in that Art Deco style, design standards, I guess, that they were trying to meet, or a look that they were going after, both of which don't appeal to me today, nor 30 years later when they started building out the rest of the downtown core area in that government complex with the Hall of Mirrors, the Len B. Jordan Building, the State Library, the State Supreme Court Building, are all very vanilla to me, both inside and out. And so as I read this plan and looked at some of the recommendations, whether it's the exteriors of the building, the heights of the building, and then I looked at the renderings of the trail and rail corridors, and to Caleb's point, where doors may face the railroad or not. I'm familiar with Salt Lake City and their light rail system, and they've just got fencing, and it's kind of ugly as it meanders through Draper and Murray and everywhere else. And I like the idea of trying to make that inviting, I just don't know how you do that with design standards and rail coming through the middle of your city. I like the renderings. I like what you put there. I just don't know that we can, A, do it safely, efficiently, have it be affordable. So again, some questions on, as we look at the design standards, what ultimately is it that we will see? Back to what I prefaced all of this with, downtown Boise, as I stood there and looked around, some of those buildings have withstood the test of time. 120 years later, they're still majestic. We're still proud of what they've accomplished, and that's what I want as we kind of look to the future of Old Town. To Councilman Overton's point, I want that history. But I also, if you go back to your very last slide, I didn't have a problem with anything that I saw on that slide. I saw the new complementing the old. I saw streetscapes. Didn't see a lot of backup traffic in the roads or anything, so that you've addressed the traffic problem in your picture. Those are the kinds of things that I would like to see, rather than a cavernous 100-foot tall buildings lining our rail corridor. I don't know how to get there with design standards. I appreciate the thought-provoking report and what it's caused me to do and reflect upon. I think we do have some work to do, and definitely feel that there should be some public input there. But I love what you said in the report in terms of we want downtown and Old Town to be a go-to rather than a go-through. 110% on board with that. I don't know that I necessarily agreed with some of the comments in there. One of the comments on page 24 was there's little to no appeal to passersby to stop and see an accountant, legal services, or financial services. And those are exactly the things that would bring me downtown and cause me to take my wife to lunch after we turn our taxes in. So think about those kinds of things that allow us to go to and stay and be a part of downtown. Just my comments. Thanks.
Appreciate it. If I can just touch on one of the little bit of the rail part of it, if I might, and that is just, it is not easy to do that, but you all have been leading the charge on this very issue with the rail with trail, very much a family-friendly desired use that connects not just Meridian, but places east and west. So that vision is already moving forward. And so I think what we try to do is complement that vision by not only on the land use of the adjacent parcels, but a linear park space, because at some point, what is the future of the rail? That's a fundamental part of this discussion, right? We just don't even really know. But also the human element part of this document is intended to make that even more vibrant and to create an experiential location to then complement some of the design standards that not everything is going to be the 100-story or 100-foot, definitely not 100-story, sorry, 100 feet. There's going to be variation, but imagine being able to go to a restaurant that sits outside looking at a green space where people are riding their bike in downtown Meridian, right? And that's the kind of vision that we're trying to not only put forth in the document, but hopefully memorialize in some meaningful way with the design standards to complement, and some of the other things that I can't really wait to get to, like the human experience chapter, maybe because I'm selfish and I love that part of it, but just some of that stuff that's, I think, to be determined.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilman Schrader.
Yeah, the rail corridor is really interesting, tough challenge, but has so much potential. I mean, I liked where you're going with the linear park space, and obviously the rail with trail has been something that we've been exploring for a long time. I think the push and pull of that is, and just a concern is if we end up with buildings that, if we proactively say, hey, look, we want to see like 8-story buildings, we want to see our density along this corridor, how do we do that in a way that kind of preserves like light and air and a park-like feel? Because I could see it turning into just, kind of masses of really tall buildings, and then you have all the issues of shadows, and it creates like a lot of challenges. So I was kind of curious about how you're thinking about that and the pedestrian element, and how can we, and I know you talked about pedestrian crossings, but kind of wanted to drill down into that. Like, how do you foresee that functioning? You know, is it a combination of fencing for safety and then you're going to have like specific crossings with kind of safety elements? Like that's something I wanted to understand. And that's a good example. Like maybe that whole stream of work is something that we kind of direct toward parks, for example, right? Like maybe one way to I'm just trying to brainstorm of how we could be proactive and trying to move it forward from a practical level. Like, you know, maybe if you had just a listing of, okay, from your perspective, these are the top priorities in changes in design standards that you want to see in order. These are the biggest changes that we think are the most important, and you sent us that. Maybe we could all kind of weigh in and say, this is what we do a lot with our code changes. We sort of say, okay, these ones we feel like we can move these ones forward. These ones we think need more work. I mean, there will be a public hearing process no matter what on any changes, but maybe that's one way to do this, is just, you know, prioritization of design standard changes from your perspective. And then I think it would be important for you to separate out changes you're requesting in our processes, because that I think is very different. I'm just trying to brainstorm, but maybe that's a way we could try to move this forward from a practical level. Is here's our updated prioritization of design standard changes we want to see you consider. And here are the things that are actually process changes and departures from how you normally do things. And maybe we could tackle it that way, sort of separating those out. And we could create some work streams where it's like, okay, we do think parks needs to take on these items, send those over to that commission and that department. Maybe there's a way to tackle that. It's a weighty document, so I think that's part of the challenge. I'm very open to that, though. I think I do think like having staff spend time on this makes sense. Like I do want to say that. I think, but I do think we have to get into a more practical framework for how to move these forward specifically. Because it's a beautiful document, but then there's a lot of verbiage, but it's like at the end of the day, I think honestly, your bullet points here are a good example of like, here are some design standard architectural components. And if you're saying, okay, you know, our number one priority is, you know, and it doesn't mean that there aren't multiple priorities, but hey, these are our top priorities, then that might help us. That might be clarifying for us. Just a suggestion.
I think we knew that the first two that we bit off were the two biggest, and this one was going to be, well, one is the first one, I think the parking is a different type of animal. This is the animal that we knew was going to be the most intensive in terms of trying to figure out where to go from here. And then we are nearing the end of our workshop, and, you know, I don't want to say, I think that this is one of the next month. I don't want to get too far away from this and just move on to the next one. I would recommend to council, they have staff take this feedback and contemplate some of the things about what would move forward in what ways in the next, and also council to give feedback after this conversation to staff on any of their thoughts, so that we could continue this specific conversation next month. To lay out a process on those elements that we think to answer those questions. But I know staff needs further guidance on, even from council, on some of the elements before they can even make those ultimate decisions. And I want you all to make sure you have time to take what you've heard and think about it. Councilman Cavanagh.
I agree with you on that. And I think I would maybe also encourage you and staff to take it one step further, which is maybe doing some of that, whether it's a pre-meeting with either council members or the liaison or you, mayor, or sending a memo to the council, so that we're not having to kind of have the process introduced, have it take a month for staff to evaluate. I mean, staff have had the destination down plan for at least as long as we have. So rather than piecemealing it month after month, if we could have them come more prepared with some of those questions as we're taking on these topics each month, I think it would make us more efficient. I'd like to see that moving forward.
I think we can start with them telling us, looking just at the appendix items, where they think that they should be addressed and what questions they need answered in order to address them. You know, what are the overarching things that they want council's feedback on? I think among the biggest is overlay or reset standards for Old Town. amongst it. And then you can get into the conversation about height specifically if we want to, when we get to that right time of the conversation.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Taylor.
I'll just be really brief. I know we need to end. I appreciate that. I think there's things that are attainable in the near term, and there's things that are very challenging and need to be more of a longer term discussion. So I do appreciate that. Any guidance we can get from staff on things that are, what they need from us to provide that feedback. But there are things I think that are close that we can do something with. And clearly there's things that are kind of further off that maybe we can have those at the proper time and discussion point.
Questions? Caleb, Brian, Bill? Okay. Well, we'll pick this one back up next month with hopefully a little bit more specifics on these elements that we can either talk about or just process and talk about them.
Mayor, council, staff, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Caver.
that I move, we adjourn our work session.
Second?
Motion second to adjourn. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. We are adjourned. Council will call this meeting to order. For the record, it is August 26, 2025 at 6:05 PM. We'll begin tonight's regular city council meeting with roll call attendance.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilman Cavanagh,
Here.
Councilwoman Little Roberts, Councilman Taylor,
Here.
Councilman Overton,
Here.
Councilman Whitlock,
Here.
Councilwoman Strader,
Here.
Mayor Simison.
Here, next is the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd all please rise and join us in the pledge.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We had no one sign up for the community invocation, so we'll move on to adoption of the agenda.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Cavanagh.
jam-packed agenda tonight. I move we adopt this agenda as presented.
Second?
Have a motion, a second, to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? If not, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the agenda is agreed to. Mr. Clerk, anyone send up under public forum?
Mr. Mayor, there's no signups.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to our action items. The first item up is a public hearing for UDC text amendment, ZOA 2025-0001. We will open this public hearing with staff comments.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Excited to be back in front of you. So this item was continued from the August 12th hearing. At that time, staff had presented a laundry list of code changes, and this was the two that council wanted us to come back and discuss with you. One being drive-through establishments. As I mentioned during that hearing, there was some discussion at a previous workshop where some of the council members were actually curious about how we were going to handle tier 3 drive-throughs. So the exhibit that I'm sharing before you kind of highlights the areas where we want some clarification from council this evening. So again, tier 3, as I mentioned at that hearing on August 12th, had to do with just those more intense, highly used drive-throughs that we're seeing when you're in and out, your Chick-fil-A's. Again, currently as proposed, these could be done and approved administratively. There is not a recommendation in the code changes before you this evening that requires a conditional use permit, again, unless they're located within 300 feet of a residential use. That's the only time they would require a conditional use permit, or they didn't meet the other 3 criteria here. So again, that is staff's proposal. I know Council President Cavanagh had asked about requiring tier 3s to go through the conditional use process. I know this body also knows that just because it goes through a conditional use process doesn't mean it's going to you first. It will go before Planning and Zoning Commission. And again, if someone were to appeal their decision, that decision could become yours. I'd also mention to you that if this can't be approved at staff level, they can go through a conditional use permit to get out of the standards. Or if we deny the request, the applicant still has the right to appeal the director's decision to you as well under current code. So there's still a way in the current ordinance for these to get in front of you if someone wants to appeal either the Planning and Zoning Commission's decision or the director's. And then part 2 of the discussion are the accessory dwelling units. Highlighted in your hearing outline this evening that there were 3 topics there that you wanted. We were looking for clarification from you on, and I've highlighted that as well in this exhibit. So one of the items were owner occupancy. So currently under the current code, the owner has to live on the property at least 6 months out of the year in order to classify it as an ADU. The second part of it was the square footages and the number of bedrooms that are allowed in an ADU. Currently, code allows maximum 2 bedrooms. And then part 3 is how do we define the parking? So as Mr. Hood had mentioned at the hearing on August 12th, stated that all of the parking in Meridian for residential is based on bedroom count. So again, if an existing residence, the primary residence in this case had 3 bedrooms and they were to add a 1-bedroom ADU, the primary residence, if it had a 2-car garage and a 20-by-20 parking pad, they would have the 4 parking stalls required by code, and they would not be required to provide any additional parking on site per the code. However, if it was a 4-bedroom home and they wanted to add a 5th bedroom or a 2-bedroom ADU on the site, the code would require them to provide additional parking on the site per UDC standard. So again, those are the three items that we wanted to, or the items that we want to discuss with you. Happy to take them in any order. I also asked Caleb if he had any comments that he wanted to provide. I know he talked with Councilman Taylor on the portion about owner occupied. I don't know if anyone else had emailed Caleb on any other topics or discussion. Caleb, anything for council?
Mr. Mayor, council. So just a couple of things. I did actually talk to the mayor for a little while last week after this conversation. We did talk about actually all three of those that are highlighted on the screen. I do have sort of if you want, sort of belt and suspenders, if you will. So the parking required, maybe taking in reverse order. Bill said I could take them in any order. So parking required. So we referenced this table. And just to maybe clarify it, a thought would be so this is the table that it references, and it says they'll be treated like single family, right? So duplexes and single families. And then there's what Bill was talking about, 1 and 2 beds, 3 and 4, and then 5 or more, tell you how many parking stalls you need on site. If we wanted to, again, it may not be necessary, but we could provide a note at the bottom of that table that also clarifies how we're going to do the total calculation for other types of land uses. When you have a mixed use project, when you have a vertically integrated project, when you have a condominium project, how we're going to classify them. So note 6 is something else that we could just say, hey, when for properties with an ADU, total number of bedrooms, see the table above, that's how many parking stalls you need. So I don't know if that helps. And again, it's kind of hand in glove. It cross-references something to this table, and then a note at the table says, essentially what you want to do for that. But I did speak to the mayor about that. And like Bill said, Councilman Taylor sent an email here. Still questioning, that was part of the conversation last week, was, the rationale behind requiring owner occupied. I will just say, 'cause it didn't come up, but it's in the plan on page 12 of the packet from your last hearing. That could have been a great transition from Destination Downtown 2.0 to this conversation. But in their plan, they also have a statement that says that the plan can be achieved by allowing for accessory dwelling units provided the main housing unit on the site is owner occupied. So even in that plan, it talks about ADUs and encouraging them, which kind of came up a little bit, but talking about having the main unit even being more specific, the main unit being owner occupied. So I hope that came across last time. I'm not necessarily married to that. I think there's some solid concepts to it. We talked about it a little bit at staff last week. I don't know that I'm of the same mindset where I think we'll just be inundated with a whole bunch of Airbnbs. But there is that's what's happening in other parts of the country with some of these, that if you don't allow an owner to be on site, they can just become overrun, and then everybody does this. And, so again, health, life safety, no, maybe not necessarily, more community character type of concern. So again, I'm not going to die on that hill for keeping it in or removing it, but that's just some of the rationale behind it, the owner occupancy. And then maximum size, again, I haven't heard anyone come up with a better rationale or different number. We've had 900 for a little while now, which it is a little arbitrary, but looking at other codes, they're usually somewhere between 700 and 1,000. I haven't seen any other code that allows an accessory dwelling unit to be larger than 1,000 square feet. So we're kind of at the upper end of what most communities would allow with an ADU. So not to put words in mouths, but I did talk to a couple of you over the last couple of weeks about those things, and prepared to change any or all of those if you'd like.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Overton.
Just speaking on just the ADUs first, where Councilman Taylor came from on not wanting to require owner on property. I'm wondering whether there's a common ground we can find. I am one of those that's very nervous about what this could turn into if we just open it up. And I'd sure like to see that when we first do this and create this, that we require at least one unit to be maintained by the owner, and even say we could revisit it in 24 months and see whether we've got a problem on our hands or we want to think about opening it up. I would rather see us keep it restrictive now instead of opening the floodgates and having a problem we've got to go back and fix. That's my only thought on that.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilwoman Roberts.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I appreciate your due diligence on this. I like the owner must be on property rather than limited to the larger dwelling. I know two situations lately where the retired person has not wanted to give up their home and have added an ADU for their kids and grandkids to come live in, so they're all on the property. So I like that flexibility. So, thanks.
Mayor.
Councilman Whitlock.
Just the word occupancy causes me pause. In my own personal life, I mean, I could see a day when we might want an ADU, even though it's prohibited by our HOA. But I would love to have one of my kids come and live and take care of the property so that I can go and serve church missions for longer than 6 months at a time. I can envision a scenario where I might be gone for a year or for 18 months and not occupying the property, but owning it. So I think the ownership piece I'm okay with. I think that addresses the concern that some of my colleagues might have as to whether or not the property would diminish over time if the owner isn't involved. But the occupancy, I still have a bit of a heartburn with that.
Mr. Mayor.
It would be enhanced by having a family member living on the property and taking care of it in my absence for 6 months and a day.
Councilman Taylor.
Thank you, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Councilman Whitlock. Yeah, so I've kind of gone back and forth trying to really understand what's the compelling argument to require the owner occupancy. Sorry, is my camera glitching out on? All right,
Yeah, it's kind of awesome.
and I'm frozen now.
We can hear you though.
My awesomeness is destroying my camera. Okay. I've really struggled to understand a compelling argument to require this. You know, I've thought, is there a public health and safety demonstrated need that we're fixing here? The answer, I don't think so. Is it just because we're concerned about what may or may not happen? That seems to be it. It seems to be where we have concerns that we don't know what to expect. But I just don't think it's grounded in fact. I don't think this is grounded in anything other than, you know, a gut feeling here. And I really hate to impose arbitrary requirements on people and their property. I think Councilman Whitlock articulated a perspective I think we should consider, which is, you know, he may want to have an ADU and have kids around, but he may want to leave for a few years or be gone for a little bit. Yet that would, you know, if we adopted this would prevent him from being able to have that ADU. There's not a compelling argument. And so unless someone can point that out to me, I'm not going to be inclined to support having that in our code where we have this opportunity. Now, to Councilman Overton's argument or statement, I said, is there a middle ground? It seems to me, if occupancy of the property is demonstrated by an individual as opposed to maybe a investment company, maybe that, you know, that way we know the individual owns the property and is responsible for maintaining it. Maybe that is something that we feel comfortable with. I don't know that I like to get that level of detail, but I really struggle when we tell people you own it, but you can only do certain things with it. And again, a lot of this is governed by HOA, so this might even be a moot point in some areas, in a lot of areas, but I really struggle with that. And I've been talking to some folks and I've just not had a compelling argument that says this makes any sense.
Mr. Mayor.
I want to piggyback on his comments really quick, just from I think I stated this, but what happens when that home is sold?
Right.
Remove it? You know, what's the rationale, after it's built? And I just look at the basic enforcement. You could require documentation to pull a building permit, but after that, you know, I don't know how the expectations would really exist. So while I understand the context, I'm generally not supportive of including the requirement that you have to do this, just because I don't think the long-term it has any viability. It may sound good, like a lot of communities that have tried to put restrictions on VRBOs, but ultimately, it's only as good as the enforcement mechanism you have to do it. So, Mr. Hood.
Yeah, just a clarification, so all of council, so we're all on the same page. Excuse me. Uh, If it's not underline or strike through its current code, so we have this on the books now, kind of a little bit to Councilman Overton's comment. We have that restriction today. So I just want, it's not a new imposition in our code. We're clarifying with some of the language what that means. So again, I'm trying to just provide you facts, not a recommendation, just letting you know, today, we require the owner to, if you build one today, the owner would have to live on site for at least 6 months.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman McCaver.
in a little bit, and I think Caleb, I think you said this 2 weeks ago, right? ADUs are not going to solve any type of housing challenges that we have. But for those that want to take advantage of it, I think trying to reduce the regulatory burdens and being able to do one should be, in my opinion, the council's goal. Recognizing that, the UDC often focuses on quality of life. I look at it first from a public safety element. If there was a compelling public safety argument to be made, I'd likely be more sympathetic. But as Councilmember Whitlock pointed out, homeowners associations, that is a great place that if this does not make sense for your community, they are prohibited. If it does make sense for your community, then they are allowed. And I think that, eliminating the owner occupancy requirement will make it easier for people who want to be able to do this. And Councilmember Whitlock's point, not be hamstrung having to be there a minimum of 6 months a year, the enforcement mechanism that comes along with that. So I'm supportive of removing it.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Taylor.
Yeah, and I just want to make a quick comment. I appreciate Caleb highlighting what is currently in code. And to that point, I am supportive tonight of removing that now that we are having a chance to look at it. I would like to remove that requirement, but I'm comfortable with keeping the owner occupancy shall be demonstrated by title records, et cetera, everything that's beyond that, just basically striking the first part of the owner occupancy. And then the rest of the stuff in yellow that's highlighted, I'm pretty comfortable with that. But that would be my recommendation tonight, is that we strike the current language from our code.
The other comment I'll make, and I made this to Caleb and the team, was on this in the maximum size, the no more than 2 bedrooms. My argument there was, I don't know why we would describe, if we go to the place where he referenced, I've got a home in my neighbor's home right next to us. They've got 6 parking spaces and they've got 3 bedrooms. They want to do a 900 square foot ADU with 3 bedrooms in it because they have all the prescribed parking. I don't know why we'd prohibit that. So to me, I don't know that prescribing that number, so long as it doesn't exceed the parking currently allowed on the property, as a base standard compared to saying 2. That was just my 2 cents on that element. Go ahead, Caleb.
This is we've had the conversation, Mayor, so, and I do appreciate the dialogue. And again, no heartburn if we want to just remove the requirement or make it a maximum of 3. I think devil's advocate a little bit. Again, community character and neighbor, you have 3, you could rent those out to college kids and they all drive a car, and now yes, per our code, you have enough parking, but that's some of the intent behind having some cap on bedrooms is, I can remember Councilwoman Strader, different context, but talking about back east and even early 1900s, you jam people in and you have about this much room to live in. So probably at some point you want to have a cutoff of how many bedrooms you can put in 900 square feet. But that, again, that's kind of the intent, is at 2 bedrooms. Again, in theory, you could share bedrooms and still have 3 or 4 college kids living in 2 bedrooms. But that's some of the intent, is a cap to be respectful of the existing neighborhood you're going in. But again, no heartburn if we want to strike through the maximum of bedrooms too.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Schrader.
I think that I do think sort of taking it step by step makes sense. I personally have a little more heartburn around just opening up the number of bedrooms and kind of the size of structures we could end up with. And part of my concern does come from neighborhood cohesion in neighborhoods that don't have an HOA. And then I do think you could end up with some, odd situations. The owner occupancy, I don't think it accomplishes enough for us to make it worthwhile, is kind of the conclusion I've come to. I mean, we at least know from the property records who owns the property. Like that at least we established that's pretty fundamental. So if there is an issue, like a code enforcement issue or a problem, like I am somewhat relying on our existing code that we've kind of covered ourselves in terms of nuisances, in terms of issues. And so I think I'd rather leave it with, for now, I think keeping with the 50% of the primary dwelling, no more than 2 bedrooms. I think that's a reasonable standard to stick with, and then letting go of the owner occupancy requirement, because I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. I don't, I don't think this is gonna result in an explosion of Airbnbs of a scale that is gonna be really challenging for us. And I think if we're having issues from Airbnbs, not to pick on that one company, VRBOs, there are many of them. If we start to see a lot of issues coming from those, I'd rather attack, I think, what the issues are and impacts on neighbors through more of our code enforcement and maybe tightening that up if we need to. I just think that that might be a better method of, if we have to regulate those, I think that's probably a better method of tackling it and being a little more agnostic as to who owns it at the end of the day. I myself have occasionally, like once I did rent out my own primary residence when we went on a vacation, and I don't know that I would ever do that again, but it was kind of fun, monetizing an asset that I already own. And I think it's good to give people flexibility with their own properties that they own. And I just don't think that the 6 months especially feels more arbitrary. And I thought Councilman Whitlock had a good point about that. So I don't know. I feel like if we can let go of the owner occupancy requirement, but maybe stick, I think for now, stick with our 50%, no more than 2 bedrooms. I think that's a good, reasonable way. And then we could always look at the 2 bedroom and those standards again in the future if we feel like we need to open that up more. But I think this would solve for most people, like the majority of what they're looking to accomplish with an ADU. I don't think most, you had a good example, Mr. Mayor, but I don't think most people are looking to necessarily achieve that. So I don't know. That's what I'm thinking for now. I'm pretty open-minded at this point.
Yeah, I don't think most people would do it. I was just looking for a rational reason to limit it as compared to this seems like a good number. So that's what I was trying to tie to. And Caleb, don't make me put you under oath. Have you ever stayed in a VRBO in another city that had an ADU unit? I know the answer, so do not lie. But no police and no one was called, so it was all good. Councilman Taylor, and I know am on the tiebreaker on that comment, if it's 3-3 of 3 keeping in, 3 keeping it out, but I don't know how you all feel about, do you feel like you have enough of a consensus on that topic?
Mr. Mayor, I believe it was 4-2. I don't think you have to break a tie. I think 4 people wanted to see.
On the owner occupancy? Okay, I apologize then. My math in my head was not good. Okay, so drive-throughs.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilman Cavan.
I'm happy to kick things off because I know I've had some strong feelings on this. And Bill, I appreciate you kind of walking through the possibilities of, particularly on the tier 2, which I look as kind of like the most intensive use. There would be a possibility that planning and zoning could hear this, or that we would hear it. I think for me, and why I'm reluctant to be supportive of the administrative decision, is it eliminates a public hearing process. And so if we don't have that decided at the administrative level, we don't have to then rely on a citizen who maybe disagrees with that decision to overcome a large financial hurdle to then have it heard before the Planning and Zoning Commission, or then to then also then be heard by the city council. So I think for me, the reason why I'm maybe not warm to the idea of the administrative decision is because I want to provide that opportunity for at least one crack at the apple from a public hearing standpoint.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilman Taylor.
Yeah, I apologize to what Councilman Cavanagh just said. Maybe I'm not following where the administrative decision-making is on this. Could staff just make a quick reminder for me about where they're proposing the administrative decision-making comes in on this?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, Councilman Taylor, essentially the proposed changes before you this evening, the goal when we kicked off this code change was to try to eliminate the burden of having to go through a public hearing process for drive-throughs. We've seen an uptick in that the last couple of years because of COVID. Every business owner almost wants a drive-through these days, and I've done studies on it, and I can tell you it's been tremendous, the amount of increase we've had over the last 5 years for these businesses. So the other part of that discussion was, well, not all drive-throughs are created equal, and we know that. And so I created this tiered approach to differentiate between the different drive-through uses. So again, in the UDC, if a drive-through is basically an accessory use to a different use. So for example, a restaurant is a permitted use in a commercial zoning district. And if someone wants a drive-through, then it's like, if you meet this criteria, it's either administrative or it's a conditional use permit under current code. Most of the time, the reason why it's a CUP is because it's within 300 feet of an existing drive-through or an existing residence or residential district. What this proposed code change says, no, we're not going to, you would still require a conditional use permit if you were adjacent, regardless of what drive-through. If you're adjacent to a residential use, you're going through a conditional use permit still. If you're converting a tier 1 to a tier 2 to a tier 3, you're going through a conditional use permit. Or if you can't meet the standards, you're going through a conditional use permit. Or if you're in the Old Town zone, you're going through a conditional use permit, almost to the discussion you had earlier where they recommended us take drive-throughs out of Old Town, but we're still allowing it through a conditional use permit. So when we have met with the industry experts, a lot of times these drive-throughs are ending in the middle of a commercial development next to another drive-through. So that's why we are changing it to make it more staff level. So in that instance, if staff were to approve a restaurant with a drive-through and none of those 4 things at the beginning of the section occurred, it would be done at the administrative level, which would be what we call certificate of zoning compliance. And we would make sure that the applicant complies with all of these standards, and we'd issue out conditions of approval and say, you're approved. Now, a resident or any affected person, I guess I think is the terminology in code now, they can appeal the director. Even if we approve it as a yes or a no, the decision can be appealed. But you're right, we don't notify any of the impacted property owners when the director issues a decision. So that's kind of the miss between our current administrative approval and it getting in front of Planning and Zoning Commission or the City Council. The neighbors would have to track that and then appeal that decision. So that's what happens. That's what we're trying to do, is to have more express standards so that we create less issues for these troublesome drive-throughs, but also approve it at the administrative level. So we don't have to go through that rigorous process, because as you hear from time and time again, right, to the developer, time is money. So we're trying to streamline the process and make it better, but also do it through express standards. So there is no perfect code to solve what we're trying to solve. We understand that not all drive-throughs operate the same. But again, after meeting with the UDC focus group, meeting with the users that have these 2-lane drive-throughs, they liked what the city was proposing. They thought this would work within their business model. I'm not advocating for that one or the other, but I know that's still a concern for city council. And that's why we were more expressive with the width of the drive-throughs. We added dimensional standards for the vehicles. We required the queuing exhibit so we know how many vehicles can stack. All of those things were baked into this code so that we got all the information to make sure that we can say, you meet the requirements, we can approve you administratively. If you don't like it, you can appeal it. Or if you don't want to meet these standards, you can go to conditional, you can go before Planning and Zoning Commission and prove why the way you operate don't need these items. Is probably the intent. Long-winded answer, but sorry, Councilman Taylor.
No,
That's how we got where we're at this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
But good, Councilmember Taylor, I'm stepping on your feet.
Councilman Taylor.
Sorry, thank you. No, I appreciate that, that explanation. I'm kind of curious if you can just comment on this, and then I'll turn it over to Councilman Cavanagh. First question. A couple of months ago, we had the Chick-fil-A drive-through kind of change, wherever it was, and we rejected that. I kind of struggled with that a little bit because I felt like our code wasn't very clear in what we were asking, and there was some room for argument on either side of that decision, I felt. It seems to me, and you please clarify, it seems to me that these changes provide the clarity that applicants and business owners are looking for, and kind of remove some of that subjective or objective view on what we're actually seeing. Would you characterize that as accurate from your point of view, Bill?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I would say that I think we do a better job of explaining it, yes, and clarifying. And in that scenario you spoke of, Councilman Taylor, In-N-Out, if this gets approved, In-N-Out can come back and ask for you to take action on their application. I think when it was before you, when that appeal was before you, staff was saying we can't approve it because they have to provide the stacking lane. In this particular link, in this updated code, proposed code changes, it says, if you don't want to meet that standard, you can go to Planning and Zoning Commission and ask them to not require the stacking lane and allow them to convert that. And they can at least show documentation of why they don't think they need to provide that escape lane
So, Mr.
or
Mayor.
some other element of the drive-through.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor and Councilman Taylor and Councilman Cavanagh, I'm sorry, I'm going to sneak in just real quick. So like the last item, what's on the screen now, again, the underline is meant to clarify the standards, right? So if it's not underlined or struck through its current code on the books today, what staff is proposing is largely what we're confirming for you. We think that this does a better job of stating for all parties involved what the expectations of the city are when you come in with a drive-through. And then above it, talks about the different tiers, right? And I guess the other thing, just real quick before I give up the microphone, is today's process. And Bill kind of alluded to it, but essentially right now, first drive-through in a complex can go in, but if you're within 300 feet of another drive-through or residence, you have to do a conditional use permit. So the Planning and Zoning Commission was seeing a lot of even single lane, tier 1 and tier 2 drive-throughs. I guess I think this transition works well because I think what I'd like to hear back from council, including Councilman Cavanagh if he has it, is I get the public input and we want that too. At what point though do you say, I live in southeast and there's a drive-through in northwest and I should be able to require them to have a public hearing for that because I'm an affected party, right? And that's what we're trying to understand. If it's a dimension, if you have to live within 300 feet or 500 feet, or we could even say, if you're a dual lane, tier 3 drive-through, you go through this public hearing process. Tier 1, can they, is it appropriate for them to be administrative if they meet all these design standards? So that's, I guess, some of the feedback is, I get the public input, but can we not standardize this to get to a process?
Councilman Cavanagh.
A couple things. And to me, public testimony is public testimony. And I want to hear from the public, whether they live next door or they live down the street. That won't ever change with me. And so to then provide added restrictions on who can and cannot come to a public hearing isn't something I would get real excited about. Where I would use some clarification is when you're looking at the definition of tier one, I read that a tier one could technically be 2 lanes because you could have a lane for a drive-through and then I think it's possibly or may include options for online and mobile ordering. So I look at that as I have a lane to go through a drive-through, and then I have a lane like the Chick-fil-A at 10 Mile that is just for mobile ordering pickup. That's 2 lanes. So I feel like by just saying a dedicated dual lane stacking, that needs a public hearing. Quite frankly, I also think that a tier one that's going to have more than 1 lane should also have a public hearing. But I'm also trying to find like that right balance of what you guys are trying to achieve. But I think it's important for us also to be aware, if we approve it this way, you're going to get dual lane drive-throughs that you're going to hear from the public to say, well, why didn't we have a public hearing on it? And what we will hear from staff is that's because it's legal, because it's not really a second lane, it's a mobile ordering pickup lane. And so I think it's important that in light of, I think over the last few weeks, we've come to some real strong conclusions about the importance of definitions and the importance about clarity. I think it's important that we as a body and you as staff have some good clarity about what it is we're saying is and isn't allowed, and when it does make sense to have the public's voice involved, regardless of where they live.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, if I can follow up. I didn't mean to imply that anyone coming here couldn't provide testimony. My comment was more about at what point do you allow people, can we not standardize the process, right? And if you design the standards for the drive-through, is there an administrative process? And if it's not, if there's not some key things that are always of concern from the public that we can't standardize, then we probably shouldn't change our process at all and keep going through the CUP for every drive-through, because you never know what someone may come and complain about. But we come up with standards that we think if you can mitigate these general concerns we have with how drive-throughs function, why should we have the public hearing? That's the premise,
Yeah, and I think,
right?
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Cameron.
I look at, we had a appeal request for us for the other chicken place, Raising Cane's. And a neighbor, a resident brought that appeal to us. And they laid out the impact of how the street network would impact their business. That may have caught administratively, it may not. It may have been found on more sympathetic ears on a city council member than a planning administrator. That to me was validation of the importance of a public hearing. And I think that is different than, hey, how a drive-through at my local credit union is going to impact my life, just because of the sheer amount of vehicles that something like that is going to generate. So I think probably for all council members present and all council members in the future, the validity and the impact of that public hearing is going to vary from council member to council member. And so to me, I saw value in that process. And it changed probably from where I was from when I read the staff report to the decision I made that night. So that to me was the validator as to why we would want to have something that looked to be a little bit more of an intense use.
So, Mr. Mayor, just sorry, one more comment on this. So I think, again, like we had talked even last week, council has a lot of discretion. This is where you live the code. You tell staff and the public how we're going to process these things. That chicken place went through a public hearing at the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that appellant participated in that. They didn't like the outcome, so they came to you. But if you want to bypass planning and zoning and council wants to look at all the CUPs, fairly easy change to our code. We just say, instead of planning and zoning commission, go to city council, and you guys can have that final discretion. Again, what are you basing your decisions on? The standards? That's what we're trying to do and avoid. So, but if we can't, then
Councilman Cameron.
You're also proposing to do away with that process, and that you guys just make the decision. And then if a resident doesn't like it, then they appeal it to the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Mr. Mayor, I need a
Councilman
quick
Overton.
clarification between Councilman Cavanagh and staff. I don't read this the way it's being interpreted. My understanding is when we were in the focus groups looking at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, because we didn't create this came out of Utah. We looked at where it was being done successfully. is tier 2 was a restaurant with one lane that functioned all three ways. So people were ordering, they were picking up, mobile ordering, and they'd ordered online. There was one lane. The only ones that had two lanes were tier 3s, and that separated them. So if staff can step in and make, am I interpreting that correctly? So tier 2 never has more than one ordering lane, no matter what they're doing.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, that is correct. That was intentional. The reason why I added and may include that is because if you've ever gone to Chipotle, they don't have a menu board. You order online and you just drive up and pick up your, that's what the intent of the code is for that tier 1. It's just like a Chick-fil-A where you order on, oh, sorry, not a Chick-fil-A, but a Chipotle. You order your food online and you go and they're like, your food's ready in 20 minutes, and you pull up to the drive-through and they hand it to you through your window and you leave. That's why I added I was trying to modernize the code to explain that not all drive-throughs have a speaker board, a menu board and speakers. They do all operate differently. So again, if we need to clarify that or even remove it, I'm happy to remove it and just say one lane and let them tell us how they operate. Because the one thing I don't want you to think is that there's going to be 4 or 5 lane drive-throughs here. I would also mention that with the financial institutions, I did have verbiage that said they could have more than one stacking lane, but I said just take it out because most banks do have 1 or 2 or 3 drive-through lanes, but because of how they operate, that's why we were very specific to say what uses this applies to, and the group voted with consensus for it. We don't need to say that. Banks are 9 to 5 usually, and they aren't impacts to the neighborhood, and they don't stack a lot of vehicles, so we removed that. But again, the intent here is to say restaurants with 1 stacking lane and restaurants with 2 stacking lanes. And then to go on, the other part of that, and what I really wanted to, I was hoping I would give you some comfort, or at least the council comfort, was really on that number 7. Basically, or 6 and 7. The number of vehicles you have to stack. You look at that, it's 6 vehicles, and we say the length. So and I understand restaurants are popular and they're going to be popular until they're not, right? The first 3 months, they're going to have, I can't mitigate for how many cars are going to go through that drive-through. But at some point they will calm down. And you heard that at Raising Cane. At some point they do level off. And so when I look at 2 stacking lanes, 20-foot vehicle, that's 240 feet of asphalt on a site. If you can't get people through your drive-through in that amount of time under normal business hours or during peak times, something may be wrong. So again, I felt that was an appropriate benchmark to try to address some of the concerns with these high capacity drive-throughs, as you guys like to mention. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying based on my research and working through the UC focus group and talking with those industry experts, they felt that that was an appropriate amount of stacking that they could accommodate their needs. So again, I appreciate the dialogue as well, because I'm not a drive-through expert.
Sure.
And we've seen a lot of issues with drive-throughs. And I can tell you, I was at the Transportation Commission, and I know they deal with them on a regular basis too, with vehicles stacking up on public right-of-ways.
Well, one question on, the only one that I know that does this is McDonald's. Is that a 1 or a 2 lane where they split them off for their ordering component? I mean, the one up here, you kind of enter from 2 different areas, but they're not even like really lanes, but other ones you only come in 1 and then they split and come back together. How do you define that?
I would call that 2, even though they merged to
Water
1 to
pumps.
pay, and I mean, you still have 2 drive-through lanes. I mean, that's how you start. If I can, just, and I'm not trying to pressure council into action tonight. But if you want to, wordsmith even some of this, I heard, Councilman Cavanagh up above even, the words do matter. And so including any pickup, like you get 1 and only 1, including any online order pickup, areas you may have. And then maybe even just back down real quick, Bill, if you don't mind. And here's where I want to, I hear the concern, right? So a little devil's advocate, and I like to kind of play that role. if there's something we can do, like just say with number 6 or 7, that triggers that public hearing, right? We can say, and here's what I heard from the industry experts and people that are designing, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. If they have to go through a conditional use permit to get the stacking lane they actually need to make their business work, they're not going to design something with 5 just so they don't have to go through one of our processes, right? If they need 7, they're going to design something where they can get 7. But my point or question really would be, we can trigger something that says if you have more than 4 stacking cars, you need to go through a public hearing, or whatever those things are that we're concerned about. Are we concerned about the stacking? Are we concerned about the proximity to residents? Are we concerned about whatever those things are? I would really like to standardize those the best we can and then say there's exceptions to that rule. And if you have an exception, you can't meet our base standards, then you go to a public hearing. That's my ultimate goal.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Cavanagh.
I think that's a really good question. And for me, it starts with that if the business is generating enough traffic that it requires more than 1 lane for a drive-through, that's the trigger,
Yeah.
right? Now, if you, for whatever reason, are tier 1 and you feel like that you've got to have a capacity for 8 vehicles per lane in a tier 1, maybe that also then, anything outside of this then triggers. Okay, what I'm trying to keep it also as simple for our residents so that they understand, hey, oh, this is a dual lane, so that's going to have a public hearing versus the nuance about the amount of cars or the amount of feet. I'm trying to keep it from we're in kind of the public face, right? The simplest approach and trying to keep that part as simple as possible for our public to understand. Not it's 2 lanes, but it came in under an X amount of, car feet lengths. And so it didn't generate one. I look at those as loopholes essentially that really, really frustrate our public. And I want less of that, not more of it.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Strader.
Yeah, I think I'm following what Council President Cavanagh is saying. I think if the principle is if you have more than 1 lane, then it's going to result in a public hearing. That's probably the right thought process because drive-throughs are very intensive and they change all the space around them. Like, I'm not going to say that they're a huge problem, but they can be. And it's nice to know, okay, residents are covered because if it's within 300 feet of them, no matter what, they have a say in it, right? If it's really close to another drive-through, we've got a say in it. But I do think that maybe the nuance is, okay, if you've got more than 1 lane, that's what triggers it because it's more intensive. I mean, it's important, I think, that we have a chance to weigh in on it. I'll also say I'm very open to the idea of prohibiting them, just generally speaking, in the old town, downtown area. Like, I think it really doesn't create the community character we're looking for in this area. And I actually thought that was one recommendation that I already felt really good about coming out of that discussion, but I'm open to waiting on that. It's just, I think maybe this is a good approach and maybe the language, like tightening that up and clarifying that so that no one reads it as an exception for mobile ordering to have an extra lane somehow. I think that's smart. People do, if they have a chance, then they can take an inch, they'll take a mile, and we know that. So yeah, maybe tightening that up is a good plan.
Mr. Mayor, just
Mr. Hood.
2 points of clarification real quick. One, on the Old Town drive-throughs, the kind of compromise back in the day was we don't allow the speaker system. Not saying that's right or wrong, but you can have a drive-through, but you don't get the menu board and that type of a thing to kind of split the difference in that community character. And then just the other thing in your remarks there, Councilman Strader, I just wanted to clarify the proposal on the table now would not allow the public hearing if you're within another drive-through of 300 feet, because we end up having 10 miles, a good example, drive-through next to drive-through next to drive-through, and no one comes to public hearings. We do a bunch of analysis, we write a staff report, we go through thousands of dollars of, so I just wanted to clarify, I'm not saying that's right, but that's the proposal on the table, is we'd remove that just because of proximity to another drive-through. We aren't saying that triggers a CUP anymore. That is the proposal.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Strader.
Yeah, I think that's important that you pointed that out because the counterexample that I would draw everyone's attention to, next to my other favorite example on the corner of Ustick and Eagle Road. Okay, we've got a Dutch Brothers that's been shoved in next to an Auntie Anne's and a Jamba Juice. And I believe at one point they even were proposing like a fourth or fifth drive-through. And like, at some point, enough is enough. There are too many flippin' drive-throughs in one parcel. Like, that's crazy. It's just not, it just becomes unworkable. So like, I actually would kind of argue the opposite. Like, if there are too many drive-throughs in one spot, it's driving me crazy. And I feel like that shouldn't be an administrative approval. Like, I'm more on the other side of that. Like, I wouldn't say I hate drive-throughs, but I like, I'm not a huge fan of seeing a ton of them in close proximity to each other where you can't even walk. Like, you'll be trying to go to the Dutch Brothers, there's a doctor's office, and you're just dodging cars. Like, it's kind of crazy how, you know, the property I'm talking about. I just don't want to see that happening.
And where at least from my standpoint, is where when you see what I would call a shared space with multiple drive-throughs is where you have challenges compared to where you have individual parcels that are more or less self-contained. And I do see that, I see 10 Mile more as the individual parcel self-contained than that situation, which is all around the same entity. And I don't know how the land uses are or the land divisions are, and if that gets into that conversation or helps with that conversation, but it's, you know, you had individual parcels of the Raising Canes next to another one that could, so, well, they were were they kind of sharing with that one? I never really.
It was within 300 feet on separate lots, yes.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna say it's always that way, that you could apply to that, but just trying to find out where they might make sense, where they don't make sense at all. For that very reason, because you do have so many movements.
Well, so, sorry, but I'm gonna, Mr. Mayor, if it's okay, just clarify a little bit here more. The underlying zoning is gonna allow these. It really is gonna be the process. So even a conditional use permit, the idea, the premise there is you can condition it, but they're still gonna likely get a drive-through unless there's just, you know, the action has to tell them what they could do to get to a yes, if we're gonna deny it at that point in time. So the drive-throughs are gonna be allowed because they're in commercial districts. So it's gonna be very difficult. So again, the idea was, well, can we come up with standards then? What are we concerned about? How can we make them design it so it shouldn't do any of those things, that it's, yep, you can have drive-through, 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 but there's no conflicts. And even with pedestrians, that's all thought out because our standards, whatever we come up with, is the silver bullet that solves that. But I just wanted to clarify, like, again, in these commercial zones, if they design them to our standards, with these or our current standards, we're likely still going to see drive-throughs, right? I don't know, you're not saying not approve drive-throughs. I'm just saying.
I'm just trying to see if there's a situation where to meet what you're trying to accomplish could be identified or not.
Ownership or something else, yeah.
Something, but Councilman Taylor, it looked like you're.
Yeah, I do have a comment. You're looking at my face and I'm trying to talk. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm going to have just a little different approach here, I think. And I'm always a little leery if I'm advocating against Councilman Cavanagh a little bit on the public input because he's the leader on that. And so I got to ask myself the question. But where I'm coming from here is I actually really appreciate the deeper dive into creating some standards that are clear and that guide this process. Because I think what we've seen and my experience in the short time is with drive-throughs has been the lack of clarity, like the lack of standards in that. I believe it seems clear that drive-throughs are going to be really kind of an innovative way for businesses to interact with their customers going forward. I don't think we can really even actually fully appreciate some of the creativity that we may see from people. And I don't want to kind of get in the way of that. So I also think this is an important part when one of my goals as a council member is I think government efficiency is really important. I think customer service from the city is important. And I see the effort here trying to get to that goal of being efficient, being responsive to people that are doing work with us. I do think there's a proper role for public input, but when there's really clear standards and there's really clear detail, and maybe we still need to add more clarity, there might be a role for us to maybe add more to this. But when there's clarity there, I think that's something we should strive for as a city. And so to me, what I see here is, I really, Bill, you said you're not an expert on drive-throughs, but you're probably an expert in Idaho now on drive-throughs because you've done a lot of reading and a lot of good work on this. I like where we're going. Maybe we need some more clarity in the standards, but I think we really should try to get the standards right and then allow the staff to make those decisions, because that, I think, that's kind of where my head is at right now. I like driving towards that goal. With the caveat, I want to respect the public input process. I'm just not sure where that should be. Maybe it's we present the standards and we ask for people to provide some detail on that. But that's kind of where my head is at with this conversation.
Just because there's a lull, I will just call to your attention, Mr. Mayor. This is a public hearing. I know there's not a lot of people, but just didn't want you to forget that aspect, please.
Nope, I was just getting ready to go there. We do have one person online and one person in the room. So council, should we see if there's anybody from the community who'd like to provide testimony on this item? Okay, if you're online and you'd like to provide testimony, please raise your hand. And if you're in the room, sit on them if you don't want to be called up here. No one raising their hands and no one coming forward. Council, how would you like to move this conversation forward? Continue the public hearing and have additional input and have staff to come back with revised, more clear definitions to achieve certain outcomes? Say we're good, move on, don't do any changes to the current process.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Whitlock.
I would concur with Councilman Taylor. I think if we can maybe send this back for another pass and some more clarity and definitions and specificity to bring back to us, again, as part of a public hearing. I don't know that people are going to come out in droves until somebody's proposing a drive-through in their neighborhood. But if we can get the standards right, that at least gives us a strong foot to stand on when we get to that.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Calver.
a question for Caleb and Bill, and Councilmember Taylor makes a good point. Do you feel that a process could exist that those standards, those important subject matter expertise standards from the planning staff could be melded with a public hearing so that you get really the best of both worlds?
So, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Kavanagh, if I understand the question, I mean, that's kind of the problem we're trying to solve. Maybe I'll just start there, is really pushing someone through a public hearing when otherwise wouldn't be required. Right? So if you want to have the public hearing, you still have some standards that you at least are basing that decision against. But if you comply, I don't know why I would have it's kind of the opposite the way it's drafted, right? If you don't comply, then you have the hearing. If you comply to have a hearing is.
Maybe, Mr. Mayor, if I can, maybe a
That's
better way to
okay.
ask the question. What's different from planning staff's standpoint from a conditional use permit that takes those standards into account, provides the mechanism for a public hearing that we would require for a tier 2, that would be different than in a tier 3, that would be different in a tier 1 or a tier 2 staff level analysis?
Councilman Kavanagh, maybe clarification. I think you're asking, if I'm restate the question maybe a little differently, you're asking us why, I guess if I'm understanding it, like what's the difference between tier 1 and tier 3 at administrative approval?
Yeah.
If I understand it, and or why we are saying we can approve all of them under these same standards versus at tier 1 at treating it. Because you're right, we are treating them all the same with the fact that we're allowing one to have more asphalt and one not to. There is nothing that goes into it. There's nothing in this particular code that speaks to intensity of use. The intensity is implied in the amount of stacking lanes and escape lanes that they're putting on the site. And it goes down to number 7 where they give us a queuing analysis. So you're right, there really isn't anything differentiating the two except for the definition of a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3. But they all will have to meet those standards based on tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Again, a little bit more, if you look through the code here towards the end, the express standards, you can see here tiered 1 and tier 2 require more stacking than actually a tier 1. So that's really the difference. All the other things still apply. They still have to show how they're stacking vehicles. They still have to provide safe pedestrian access to the site. They have to demonstrate that they're not stacking on the adjacent public right-of-ways. So like Caleb mentioned, a lot of the stuff in code is remaining. We're just building upon it to make more express standards. And that's why you see the strike through and underline and the entire underline sections, because those are all new sections that we've vetted through the UDC focus group.
Mr. Mayor, if I can sort of, I don't know, poll the council a little bit, because I think we're prepared generally to do where I think this is headed, do some more wordsmithing and proposals. But I do kind of want to understand, again, we could come up with a model that says there's still some administrative approval for, let's just use the current tier 1 and tier 2. You know, if you're bank, maybe you don't need it. Now, save the other things. If you're within 300 feet of a home or 500 feet of a home and some of the other caveats, right? And it needs to still be designed, but you could go through a staff level administrative approval. But if you have dual lanes, you're triggered. Like you go to hearing. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward change that we could make if there's these general, like, you know, if that's the thing, right? Or even a single lane that stacks more than 8 cars, right? Like another trigger. Hey, if you're showing this long of a drive-through, then you need to go through a CUP. So that's some of the feedback. If that's where we're at, then that's fine. This is the starting point. This is what we came up with. But if there's some tweaks or other triggers and you're like, hey, okay, but what about if they do this or that? What? Yeah.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Cavan.
that's where I'm certainly supportive of, and I recognize I've monopolized a lot of the conversation about this one tonight. This is one I have some pretty strong feelings about, but that's in line with what I think is acceptable and doable and probably appropriate, with just also maybe the acknowledgement too that, you know, that in that definition that a tier 2 can exceed more than 1 lane. I just think that that's provide clarity, regardless if it's for mobile pickup, if it's for a, you know, Chipotle only pickup, or if it's, you know, a traditional drive-through with a menu and a speaker.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilwoman Schrader.
So I think that's a decent approach. 2 lanes or more, you go to CUP. I do want to see us reconsider the concept of close proximity to another drive-through triggering CUP. And I think for me, it's like, if it's on the same parcel is a big piece of that. I don't know if you all want to think about that and maybe get input from other council members if they share that. Again, it's not great but unfortunately, the way the human mind works, at least my mind, is I always go to the worst possible example. It's like where I'm coming from, but I just, we can't see that happening on a regular basis. It would just make things so unworkable to have that many of them in close proximity. So maybe there's a better way to address that than how it was before. I don't know, but at least with the 300 feet language before, at least we kind of had a catch-all that I thought worked. We did make a lot of progress on ADUs. I don't know if people are thinking maybe we could move that forward, the ADU piece. And
So, Mr. Mayor, if you don't mind, sorry to interrupt. I'm good. You know, I appreciate the offer because I think I'm off the hook, but it does make more work for legal staff, Unicode, the clerk's office, if we have all these different ordinances. So I don't think that's an emergency. I think it can wait for
Okay.
this, and then we have to update all of our codes, so it'd be 3 code updates. So again, I
Whatever
appreciate
works
the
best for
offer.
You guys, yeah.
One other just curiosity. Okay, I know Sonic technically only has one drive-through, but they got 40 parking stalls. If something like that, is that just a tier one because they only have one drive-through, or are they considered in some other vein in that scenario?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, it will come down to definitions, as you know, and that's where you enter the stacking lane and exit. So that's the drive-through portion of it, not parking.
Mr. Mayor.
So 40 mobile pickup windows doesn't count. It essentially is. I mean, yeah. Definitions.
But Mr. Mayor, members of the council, certainly that's something we could address in this as well. If that's, I think everything's on the table if that's something that we want to say that. Again, in our code, a drive-through is conducting business from your vehicle. And then how we measure a drive-through is where you enter, you order, and then where you exit. So that's the definition of the drive-through. So again, I'll give you a prime example. You order your groceries online, you go to Walmart, it's not a drive-through.
Right.
It doesn't even fall into this definition. We don't consider that a drive-through, and we haven't. So almost like your point, if someone has 40 stalls, you order online, pick it up, you're parking.
Really, the only place where I was going to was the impacts on neighbors. If we're talking about what makes sense for a neighbor impact, sometimes it's operational style versus that, which has as much of an impact as the drive-through. That's all I was really trying to get to in that context of more. I mean, that even Sonic is, I think, started to take away some of their, you can't order, you have to mobile app order, you don't order. So it's, again, viewing it a little bit differently as they've changed their technology, but I'm just trying to see where if it fit differently or not, or the next type of thing. And I'm just like, in and out says, we're just gonna go to come and park and we'll bring it out to your car.
So, Mr. Mayor, maybe just real quick on that, a little bit off topic, but it's still applicable. So all of those uses then would be in a commercial zone. So your base zone, if there's residential nearby, that's why we have the landscape buffers, irregardless of kind of how they operate business. We'll transition, right, from commercial to maybe office to then residential. So you have the separation irregardless of overtime and changes in society and what they might do in their parking lot or building additions. You've got sort of this buffer area, right? I mean, that's the concept with a lot of those is any and all of those should be allowed because it's on commercially zoned land. And we've already mitigated some of those impacts when we annexed and zoned the property. Can I, one more, and I'm not trying to drag this out. I'm glad we're the only thing on the agenda though. Maybe just one more comment back to Councilwoman Strader's comments. And I like it. I'm trying to figure out where council's at here with some of this. You know, today, 300 feet of another drive-through triggers the CUP. I'll be honest, the ones that we have the most problem with are actually when it's you own something, I own something, and he owns something, and we can't get them to communicate together because this is mine and that's yours. And I don't care what you do on your side, but here's when it's one, we can kind of master plan it and you have main drive aisles with drive-throughs that kind of circulate together. So I appreciate the comment and I get where you're trying to go, but I don't know that trigger, it actually is the other way around where it's those properties where you have your own lot that we get. It's tough to require the connections, the shared access points, those types of things. So I guess what I would propose maybe to get to maybe the same thing is, you know, where there's more than two within 500 feet or some distance of each other, that triggers it. Cause now you're getting a conglomeration of those types of uses. And again, somewhat arbitrary, right? Just throwing numbers out. But if you know, maybe you're not the second one within 300, but if there's 3 of you within 3 or more within a certain distance, then that could trigger that conditional use permit too. Just as a on the fly thought, if we're going to bring something back, don't be surprised if you saw maybe some version of that. So spitballing here.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I had a couple thoughts too, about, based on some of the conversation. I could see, for example, your example of the pull-through parking. I know a lot of drive-throughs use that when their stacking lanes get congested. They say, move forward to a spot. I think that is an opportunity for the decision makers to put a condition on a project that if they're in front of you and they don't want to meet, for example, the overflow, the stacking lane or the escape lane requirement, that's something where I see someone saying, okay, then you need to provide additional overflow spots for customer pickup. I can see that as a way to mitigate some of those concerns to eliminate the stacking. Or again, we can also require that in code. We can say, if you don't provide these things, then here's another requirement. You have to provide X amount of overflow parking so that you don't back into the drive aisle. Everything has to be contained within this, in the drive-through lane. If you spill over, you got to provide X amount of overflow parking for customer pickup. Part two of that, and the other discussion I've had with the UDC focus group is going back to Kayla's point, when there are multiple drive-throughs on a site, we talked about having the developer provide us a master plan of the entire area so we can see how the new drive-through interacts with the existing drive-throughs, and then we can determine whether or not there's going to be conflicts. That did not make it in this section of the code. So that's certainly something that we can go back to the drawing board and see if we want to incorporate that as a requirement. Show us how it works with the overall development. Because I'm with you. I can think of a couple developments that have a lot of drive-throughs. I like it when they're isolated. It works better when you have a dedicated drive aisle through the shopping center, but then each drive-through is kind of isolated on its own individual parcels. Doesn't slow down traffic too much, but at least you don't get that stacking in there and you move through the parking lots. When you just have those just drive aisles that interface and shared with one another, like your example on Eagle Road, where you could have more conflicts because there's shared parking, shared drive aisles, and it just gets messy. So again, those are some of the ideas that I've kind of written down. If you want to send staff back to maybe buttoning this up or coming up with some more express standards.
Mr. Mayor.
I do like where some of this conversation is going.
You, Mr. Taylor?
Yeah, that's me. That's me.
Councilman Taylor.
It's hard to read the room and body language from Zoom. So two thoughts. This is a fantastic discussion. I really like it. With respect to sort of the drive-throughs, I really think we need to get the standards right. And if it includes adding more things to what's on the list, I think we should get it right. Because I think we'll really appreciate that. I think that will be helpful for our development community to have a lot of clarity about what we're looking at. I'm also supportive generally to the idea of if it triggers a certain type of intensity of use, that it just automatically triggers a process where public input. If that's 2 lanes or a level 3 or tier 3, I'm open to that concept because it seems to me that the public feedback is generally around the intensity of use as opposed to whether or not someone has a drive-through. So my suggestion for tonight would be, with the ADUs, I think it's not life-threatening. We can clearly let that stay with the changes. We can accept those all at the same time. So I'm fine with waiting so that there's just simplifying some of the staff process. But I think it would be wise for staff, maybe with taking some of the comments here and also giving council, if we have some more feedback that we want to provide, to get the standards right and more clarity and add a little bit more, and then bring this back for a discussion here in the near future. That would be my suggestion for tonight.
Oh, essentially looking at a continuance on this item. So team,
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I would request some time to do that. I want to get with some of the UDC focus group members that help me work on this and see what they think about tweaking this and bringing back something with a few more express standards for your consideration.
you think in a month?
I would appreciate a month or more, yes.
Mr. Mayor, maybe Mr. Neri,
Councilman Cameron?
can we just continue to it a date certain till planning staff is ready to come back?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Cavanagh, I mean, you can do it either way. We can continue to a specific date. Because this is legislative, we can, it's only agenda notice in the future anyway. So if you want to just, leave that to staff to notice it up, that's fine. We can set that at a future agenda meeting. That's
With that,
adequate.
do it right as opposed to having to work against a certain deadline. Okay, great. Mr. Mayor,
Councilman Cavanagh?
move we continue item 1 to a date certain, wait to hear from staff on when they want to bring this back on our agenda.
Okay.
A motion second to continue this item. Is there discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the item is continued. Council, anything on our future meeting topics or a motion to adjourn?
Mayor,
Councilman Cavanagh?
we adjourn the meeting.
Second?
Motion second to adjourn the meeting. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. We are adjourned.